In this video, I discuss the old and the new right, and I explain what they are and what they mean today. So here's my disclaimer. I'm talking about the various labels used in this video in the American sense. Labels like conservative and libertarian have meaning in other countries and have different historical contexts and don't exactly line up with how we use the term in this country. Everything in this video comes from the perspective of American politics. So some people today tend to think of conservatism as something that popped up in the 60s with the advent of Barry Goldwater, and then later in the 70s and 80s with Ronald Reagan. But in reality, the seeds of today's conservatism started in the 1930s and 40s after Congress created the New Deal and FDR's utilization of executive orders to expand the government's powers and roles in society. Modern conservatism today is essentially something called the new right. And I'm not talking about the catchphrase that just found its wings in the last year in the advent of the Trump presidency. I'm talking about the legitimately named movement that rose up as a reaction to the rise of socialism and communism in the early 1900s. The new right has three essential phases, but represents a larger, overarching right-wing ideology of capitalism, individualism, limited government, among other things. The first phase essentially starts after the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt through the 1960s. The second phase is from the rising popularity and presidential run of Barry Goldwater through the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency. And now the third and newest phase starts with Donald Trump's presidential campaign. But in the end, these are just expressions of groups of people with political leanings on the right, and not necessarily the exclusive domain of any right-leaning subgroup like neoconservatism or paleoconservatism. The three phrases are descriptive, but not the best labels to use. So I use the term new right to delineate between post-FDR conservatism and the old right for classical liberalism that dominated the country up to and through the early parts of the rise of communism in the Soviet Union and China. So the old right is before FDR, and the new right is since then. American conservatism is essentially an ideology of right-wingers in this country that is largely hearkening back to some of the heroes of our movement, from the founding fathers through Abraham Lincoln, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, to more recent icons like Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, Ron Paul, and controversially George W. Bush and Donald Trump. And those are just the presidents and presidential candidates. There are also economists like Hayek, Friedman, Mises, and Rothbard, to Burke, Kirk, Sowell, and Buckley, and many, many others. So let me talk briefly about the two conservative subgroups I not so subtly mentioned already, the neocons and the paleocons, which effectively define the majority ideological groups in the conservative movement today. I'll start with the oldest group first. Paleoconservatives are the closest thing today that we have to the old right, as they advocate for smaller government, the classical version of liberalism that's grounded in individual liberty. They also try to walk back the New Deal, and they often focus on the U.S. Constitution in terms of a set-in-stone document granting limited powers to the government, which can only be amended legally, and they are against agencies and laws that are created unconstitutionally. These are often called the traditionalists among the right, and often the religious right are the more politically comfortable with this group. They're typically more nationalist and anti-globalist, focusing on subsidiarity and localism, federalism and distributed powers, but they can be protectionist in terms of immigration and trade, and are generally the greatest opponents of granting mass amnesty to illegal aliens. While they may not have the reputation as interventionists that the neoconservatives are so popular for, after Ronald Reagan's presidency, there's no shortage of people here who, if they have to engage in war, they are all in, but once done, they're all out. They can be credibly accused as being more willing to use the government force to legislate religious morality, however. And this leads to the newer group on the right, hence the term neoconservatives, who often think of themselves as taking over the reins of this movement, and they largely believe themselves as the modern branch of right-wing ideology. While many of them do not believe the Constitution is a living, breathing document, they generally abide by the terms of judicial activists on the left and cede ground gained by liberals and progressives through judicial review. They're typically more internationalist and globalist for bringing down trade barriers between countries, but are more active in terms of spreading capitalism worldwide. They also believe in federalism and state rights, but aren't as reserved about a new world order, international bodies like the United Nations and NATO, and are generally less protectionist and in some cases advocate for the use of amnesty for some illegal aliens and otherwise for easing restrictions on foreign employees, the visa program, etc., things of that nature. However, they also have inherited the label of interventionists and frown upon what they see as isolationism by the paleocons and other right-wing groups. And they have a reputation of being against repealing the New Deal, reducing spending on entitlements, and compromising individual liberties with modern liberals in return for increased military spending to finance wars and to make a difference in the world. They could be also credibly accused of wanting to see a great society of their own. There are other factions on the right, but these are largely the two warring conservative branches which inform the conflicts on the right. Neither of these groups are more right-wing than each other. They just have different underlying philosophies and different priorities, and it's possible to see people cross over between the two or sometimes straddle these lines. But I've heard multiple people in both groups claim that those in the other group aren't real conservatives, and I strongly disagree. But what I've described up to now, today, is essentially the scope of conservatism as we know it in the modern world. Now it's time to talk about libertarianism in this country, as they've been a largely invisible subgroup on the right that takes some elements of the paleo and neoconservatives, but largely remain on its own direct and distinct movement that could either be called far right or extremely liberal in the classical sense. This group argues for the least amount of laws, the least amount of government force, and is often considered the most socially liberal group on the right. Some libertarians, however, would argue whether or not someone is socially liberal, moderate, or conservative, it doesn't matter so long as they are not using government force to coerce such behavior. In fact, many of these people advocate going even further towards less enumerated government powers than the Constitution allocates, or even state and local governments. So how does this typically compare to conservatism? Libertarians believe in as little government as can be gotten away with, and any government entities that there are must be voluntary. Maybe you pay for a certain set of services and opt out where your money goes to. A constitution that relies on a social contract is replaced with a literal contract you must sign and agree to, but that you can also opt out of. They are also for subsidiarity, localism, regionalism, and at worst, a sort of nationalism, but only to the extent to outline jurisdiction, not necessarily advocating for a strong central government that makes decisions for citizens. There's definitely a focus on free trade, a shared currency if possible, this backed on a viable commodity like gold or silver, and not a fiat currency. To be clear, they don't see much of a role of the government or any government in our personal lives. Libertarians are not necessarily for international bodies like the United Nations or NATO, but they can see value in voluntary versions of such in their ideal system of governance. They're also not generally against immigration, though any welfare type services are not aimed for non-citizens to avoid exploitation. And lastly, they are the most isolationist of any of the groups on the right, completely against war, against and strict self-defense, and are often an influence on paleo and neoconservatives. The Tea Party movement is actually a great example of libertarian and paleoconservative influences on conservatism as a whole, and a rejection of neoconservative policy and figureheads of the 2000s. And they are against the progressive backlash with Obama and his Obama coalition. Many of these people are fans of Ronald Reagan or grew up under his presidency and are often supporters of Ron Paul. So the Reagan and Ron Paul revolutionaries are often the most vocal advocates of the Tea Party, and many of those have subsequently supported the recent rise of Donald Trump to his presidency as a foil to the Bush, Clinton, and Obama administrations. So that should provide a general overview to who the old and the new right are, and the three groups in the new right today: the Paleoconservatives, Neoconservatives, and Libertarians. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.